Okay, Crecganford, thank you for joining the archive today. Welcome.
Thank you very
And
much.
like you say at the beginning of your videos, grab a cup of tea. And because this is an extended video, I got some
Oh,
chocolate fudge.
fudge. Oh, that's quite topical, yes. That's
Yes.
what it is. Yeah, so we're having a heat wave here, so I'm on iced water, unfortunately. It's the
It-
last day of British summer today. Back on the tea tomorrow.
all right. Today in America, we are actually having a surprisingly cool 75 for August.
Okay,
Able
so this is
this,
a hot 75 in Britain. So yes, you're used to it. We're not. Yes.
yeah. Normally it's hot and humid, and you're melting in with your couch. But today it's dry, and I'm actually able to enjoy a cup of tea. So welcome. Let's get started with just briefly talking about your background in studying Indo-European.
Yeah. So my background is I initially studied Anglo-Saxon literature and then went on to study Old Norse literature. So that's the Eddas and the Icelandic sagas. And it was from that that I started to see how important Indo-European mythology was. There were many common stories between Saxons, the Saxon world, and the Nordic world. And then you realize these actually trace back to Indo-Europeans or what people sometimes call Proto-Indo-Europeans, which I can explain about later if you want. And then when I studied that, I realized actually all the myths around the world, well, not all of them, but many myths around the world are connected in some way. Like these stories have been told for many, many generations over many millennia. And I thought it was fascinating to try and understand the sources of these and what these myths meant and why they persisted and what was so special about them and why they changed. And so that is what I now do. I don't do it full time. My other specialist subject, I'm in for IT for those who are non-IT based, because that's simple. But for those who are technical, I spend quite a bit of time writing artificial intelligence systems that try to understand language, especially semantics within language. And I do so it studies to see if two sentences mean the same thing, and if they do or don't. So a quick example of this is if I said, "Is a three-legged dog like a four-legged dog?" Most people would say no. But if I ask you, "Is a four-legged dog like a three-legged dog?" Most people will say yes. And so you get this oddity in English language, let alone translations of languages. And I try and make that automatic, that translation, because that speeds up the work I do when studying literature.
Okay. All right. So
It's like,
it's a very yeah. No, I'm pretty sure that's a very interesting thing. I'm trying to wrap my head around that. You must find some very interesting uh, patterns, progressions. Uh,
yeah, I look at it far more black and white at that. I mean, but with the IT hat on, I just look at can I translate a document in a foreign language or as quickly as possible, or can I get
okay.
a summary of a meaning of a document in English language as quickly as possible? Because that saves a lot of time. I mean, there are many old books that were written in the 17th, 18th, 19th century that would just be impossible to scan and translate in a normal way. Yeah, and you don't really want to go through page by page translating it word by word because that'll take ages. So all I'm trying to do is speed up my own work, but in but as an output of this, I'll create tools that others researchers can use if they want.
All right. So that's interesting. So have you so what like have you decoded any documents or
Yeah, I've translated a few documents. What have I done recently? So for the work on dragons, so I've got a dragon video coming out on August the 20th or thereabouts. That was originally written, the source document was originally written in French for, I'm doing some work on the Yggdrasil. So in the Nordic myths, there's the Yggdrasil, the tree, the world tree. And there's an interesting document by it's a thesis by Ottar Gundik, and that's in Norwegian. And again, I've translated that into English, and it just helps people to do it because wouldn't normally get access to those in an English language. But as I say, it's really important, and I know it's a question you wanted to ask about translations, is that to read a document in your own language and try and understand it is difficult, especially if it's old. But to read a translated document from an old language that is so fraught with potential errors and mistakes, you have to be really careful. So it's ideal that you read 2, 3, 4, 5, or as many translations as you can to try and understand what what was the original document said. So to translate a document is a very important aspect to understanding mythology correctly, or anything written in a foreign language, certainly from a while ago.
Okay, so that brings up my next question. So when you're translating and going through these older languages, um, you said flaws. Would that mean does that indicate that older languages were flawed, depending on who's the person writing it, or
Yes. So there's a number of things here. So one, yes, the languages could be, like, whoever's writing it could be flawed in what they are writing, but equally the translation could be flawed. Equally, people from a different time had a different perspective on things, so may describe things we know today in a very different way. So there are all these complications to try and work out what someone means, and certainly people also had metaphors and the like for language. Probably one of the best examples well known is Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is written in English, but if you actually read it in the dialect at the time, with the accent at the time, you will actually bring out information in Shakespeare's plays that aren't obtainable if read in today's contemporary English. It will bring out puns you wouldn't necessarily see, like the word hour, meaning 60 minutes, also means back then it would have meant whore. And so if you charge, so he makes a play on that. So if someone's saying it, you get this double entendre you wouldn't pick up if you just read the book today. And so there's all these things. Yeah, these are one example, but as you say, you also get biases as well. And the other famous one in history we know about is Snorri Sturluson and the Prose Edda.
Because he was a Christian.
He was a Christian and a Christian scholar, and without doubt, some of the stories and writings he put within the Prose Edda are, in effect, conversion tools to try and convert pagans into Christianity. And so, there was an example where he tells a story, for example, of Thor completing 3 tasks, and Thor fails these tasks. Now, that would never be a story written by pagans. They would not write a story saying, "Oh, Thor failed these 3 tasks." I mean, Thor does some silly things and is a bit of a comedic duo with Loki at times, but he wouldn't be seen as a failure. So this is, I would say, clearly a Christian conversion tool, but it is now academic consensus that, for example, that particular story was written by Snorri to help show that the gods have failings, and therefore people should worship the Christian God.
Okay, that with Snorri that does make more sense. For my experiences with Snorri prior to starting to listen to scholars like yourself or someone else who I had on my show, Thor, um, my experience was reading about him as a person and hearing that he was just somebody that documented. He was able to successfully document a lot. So it's very interesting hearing his bias during a time where.
Yeah, I mean, you need to understand why he documented it. So he didn't document the Prose Edda to keep a history of the Nordic tales. As he documented it to teach about Old Norse poetry, because the Old Norse poetry was deemed quite a beautiful subject when he was alive, and that's what he was teaching people, how to write this poetry. So he wasn't so concerned over accuracy of the of what he's writing in terms of poetry and tales. Although we do have to assume that much of it is probably accurate, I'm sure there is a fair chunk, definitely a fair chunk that isn't.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I didn't know that about him before you told me this.
Okay.
All right. So now we'll go back to what was initially planned as my first question
So
after asking.
Proto-Indo-European is a language, and Indo-European refers to people who live in Europe through Persia and into India. Now, it's often assumed that when you say Proto-Indo-European, you mean Indo-Europeans who were alive at the time the Proto-Indo-European language was spoken. So that probably started, I believe it started probably around 6,000 BCE, the first elements of that. And it was at its peak probably about 4,500 BCE, so 4,500 BCE. And then by 2000 BCE, the Proto-Indo-European language pretty much gone into its own localized languages. And Indo-Europeans, I say, it's just a general term for the people who live in that region. But depending on the time you're talking about, because it's really because you can't just say Indo-Europeans because they've been around for 8,000 years. So, they've been done 8,000 years is a lot of years to do lots of different things. So it's very hard to say Indo-Europeans did this. But in terms of the Proto-Indo-European speaking peoples, the Proto-Indo-European speaking Indo-Europeans, they were very influential because they seem to be one of the first peoples to successfully farm cattle, and they managed to do that because they successfully used the wheel and rode the horse. And what this means is that if you're farming cattle and you haven't got a wheeled transport or you can't ride a horse, you're limited to farming cattle probably within a mile of your home successfully. But if you have got a horse and you've got wheeled transport, you can farm cattle 10 miles from your home, maybe even 20 miles from home if you live in it. And therefore, you significantly expand the area you can farm in. You can farm more cattle, and cattle meant you were rich. And cattle were the most valuable thing at the time. And this is shown in the beliefs of the Indo-Europeans. And because they were rich and successful and had access to lots of good food, wheeled transport, and could ride horses, they spread rapidly. And as they spread rapidly, their beliefs spread rapidly. And we literally see influence from their beliefs from India all the way through to Britain, across that landscape, that part of Europe and Asia. And that is their influence. And so many things we see when you talk about religion today and beliefs, many of those stories we can trace back to those Indo-European people.
Okay. And so, from my understanding, this was the step out from prehistoric humanity. Like this was
Prehistory is pre-written history. So you probably mean it's like from Stone Age to sort of Bronze Age, Iron Age. It was that period of time. So and you'll find that the earliest Indo-Europeans do look like they had access to metalworking, smelting. So around sort of 5,000 BCE, 6,000 BCE, I think. It may not be quite that old, but we actually see the first signs of smelting happening in the Indo-European. So that's far earlier than the standard Bronze Age. And so that's one of the things that they brought with them and probably helped some of the technological advances they had that made them so successful.
okay. Interesting. I learned a little bit just right there.
Okay, so and one of the reasons we know that, and just as a little side story, then, is that one of the things I study in mythology is some of the oldest stories we tell, even the oldest fairy tales. And the oldest fairy tale we know is called The Devil and the Smith. And The Devil and the Smith is about a deal a blacksmith makes with the devil to sell the devil his soul if the devil allows him to join any two materials together. Okay, so because that will make him a great smith. And what happens is the smith joins the devil to a large rock, and says, I'm not going to release you from the rock, devil, unless you give me my soul back and let me keep my skills. And the devil says, okay, then fair enough. And everybody lives happily ever after. But because that is called the devil and the smith now, it sort of relates to metalworking. And we thought that's very odd that there's this old story, and this story is again about 8,000 years old, talking about smithing. That doesn't make sense. And it's the archaeological find that was after we realised this of smelting so long ago that we thought, oh, perhaps there is a reason for that story. So, yeah, that's how we know that there was metalworking, or another piece of evidence of metalworking so early on.
Did do you think any of these stories, is just something that came off the top of my head, do you think stories like this helped influence or was the very beginning of things that would later on become alchemy?
Oh, I'm not too sure. I think alchemy is probably a later thing when more complex things were understood. I'm not too sure. I mean, whilst humans back then were able to repeat tasks to create similar output all the time, because they did that when producing drinks like beverages and alcoholic drinks, they knew how to make those. I don't think the progression of, because was gold a thing back then? I don't, not early on. Gold wasn't a thing that took us again a few thousand years on. So um, I guess as soon as something valuable like gold came along, then it probably helped alchemy come to be. Before gold, you had cows, and cows were important. So it's about how do you get more cows, and that's one of the big stories of Indo-Europeans. Is the cow was key to the creation myths, and that's why in Hinduism the cow is sacred. That is a hangover from Indo-Europeans believing the cow is important. But the cow is also a key part of the sort of knight rescuing a princess from a dragon story, where cows actually get mistranslated to mean women. And so the story of a soldier killing a dragon to rescue cows turned into a knight killing a dragon to rescue women.
Okay. Strangely, I do like that story. Maybe that's what Disney needs to do next, is talk about the importance of cattle.
Well, exactly. But you see that. But Beauty and the Beast, a famous Disney story, that is again an Indo-European story, thousands of years old.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, since we're on the subject of still talking about stories, one story that has crossed my mind a lot is Skyfather stories. And something that's kind of brought up more questions watching some of your videos, like your video on the world's oldest myth or the creation myths,
Mm-hmm.
are when people say Skyfather, would that mean they had literally a sky father? There was some type of sky deity, or is that the interpretation of seeing the pattern, the weather patterns, or the signs in the sky that the weather was changing, that something was on its way, a storm was on its way, lunar cycles that people relied on in order to survive through the year?
That's an interesting question. The answer is a bit of a combination of those things. So, before or outside of Indo-European culture, and certainly before Indo-European culture, then storm gods were quite important. Okay, so and that was because rain was important, and rain was important because we needed crops to grow. Without rain, crops didn't grow. We understood this quite early on in farming, or very early on in farming, which is why irrigation became a thing. And when irrigation became a thing, then that allowed us to do stoneworking, and that's how we managed to build things like pyramids, because there's an offset of if you know how to dig grooves in stone for 2,000 years, suddenly you know how to build a pyramid.
Yeah,
People think
put
that it's
one
magic, but
rock
it's not.
next to the next.
Exactly. So, but anyway, but rain's really important. So, storm gods were always a big thing. Even Yahweh, the Abrahamic God, is thought to have been a storm god initially. In many beliefs, we see some of the earliest myths all talk about storm gods creating rain and floods. But what we also see there is that at the time, the storm god isn't the most important god. There's usually another god that the storm god, I wouldn't say reports to, but it has a leader, or someone to go to. And this is, I think, where the Sky Father comes in. I think the Sky Father within the Indo-Europeans became that symbol to someone who was overarching across the whole world, because these people could travel, had more insight into how big the world was. And the sky is obviously the thing that covers the world. They saw it from that perspective, and the storm god was a separate entity. Now, what is quite interesting is that the storm god then sometimes gets absorbed back into the Sky Father. And we see this. So Zeus, the Greek sort of major god, he was originally called Zeus Perkinus. And Perkinus is the name of the storm god of the Indo-Europeans. So Zeus is actually from Deus, meaning sky. And Zeus comes from Zeus Futter, which is the Sky Father from the Indo-Europeans. So Deus Futter is turned into Deus, or sorry, it's going to turn into the Deus of the Greeks. And then he's absorbed the storm god that was possibly already there from a previous migration. And so the Sky Father is just an overarching male deity, and some say again that then possibly led to the Earth Mother, or the Mother Nature figure, being the opposite of that, being the physical world the sky sits on, and that's why the Earth is a female. So, but and it's hard to say whether the Sky Father came before the Earth Mother or the Earth Mother came before the Sky Father, is a trickier question to ask. Because of how agriculture works, I believe that the Earth Mother was probably an earlier deity. And I do have a video called Finding the Older Gods, and I try to explain this, that certainly if you go into Greek mythology, you see that gods or goddesses like Demeter, which means the mother, she almost certainly was a god already in the region of Greece before the Indo-Europeans came along. And she's kept, and we see this because of certain aspects of how she's presented in Greek mythology. She doesn't have the same rank as the Olympians, the gods of Olympus.
Okay. So kind of just bouncing off that, there's a god that like the sky father that or like a storm god would go back to, and Earth Mother. So relating back to your dragon myth, Tiamat was a god that her body was used to make the earth.
Yes, a primordial being. Yes, not a god, a primordial being, which is a slight difference. You'd upset the gods by calling her a god, which you probably don't want to do. So yes, and that's really interesting. That's a very old creation motif.
Okay. And you did do other videos relating back, like your oldest myth, I think it was your oldest myth video, talking about how there are some deities or some beings that were used, their bodies were used to make the earth.
Quite complicated. So the Indo-European, we go with the Indo-European view, which is the sort of because of the last 8,000 years of religious thought across Europe and into India, and they had a view that at the beginning of time there were three primordial beings. There's someone called Manu, someone called Yimo, and a giant cow. Cow's very important. Like probably came in slightly later on, but that's all time. And Manu means man. Yimo means twin, and the cow is just the cow. Although eventually it was given names in other literature. And the warrior who eventually kills the dragon was called Trito, meaning third. So you have this 1, 2, 3, Mano, Yimo, Trito thing going on. And what we tend to find usually is that Mano sacrifices Yimo to create the world. And what happens is Yimo is considered, so Manu then becomes a priest-like figure. Yimo becomes a king figure, but because he's now dead, he becomes king of the other world, which you could consider a devil-type figure, but it isn't like that. The other world at that time was pre-judgmental. It's where everyone went when they died.
Yeah. They never
Uh,
saw the underworld as like you're going to hell. This is a bad
uh,
thing
n-
to go to.
Not early on. There was a split we see later, which we'll put a pin in that, and we'll come back to that because that's another diversion we're going. Um, but we see this, but we also see things like the cow sacrifice to make the world, and we see that in the Indic cultures, which is why the cow is sacred because it's been used to create all living things. So you see this natural aspect of things being split to create the world, but the Mesopotamian belief, which isn't Indo-European, although is probably influenced a bit to Indo-European, has, as you say, Apsu and Tiamat at the beginning of time. These are primordial beings that live in water, so very dragon-like. But because there's two of them, it's also twin-like. And it is Tiamat who is eventually killed, split, and creates a firmament, a land and a shell inside the watery cosmos of the universe. And what's interesting about that is that because there's some holes in this shell, that's why it rains, that's why there are rivers coming up. But that in itself could be considered a an evolution of the creation myth coming from an egg, where some believe that or the early forms of creation myth had an egg in two parts, the bottom being the land and the earth, the top being the sky, and using that to create the earth. So that split may have actually evolved from that. So it comes from an egg, which you could say is Mother Nature-esque, coming because you need a woman to birth an egg, which leads then to a person being split to create this world, which leads to this sort of twin thing we see in. But the egg itself is interesting if you've seen my creation video, because the egg could then have evolved from an earlier view that man excreted to create the world due to uh, there being a very male bias in many myths, because most myths we hear today have been told and maintained by men, where the versions told and maintained by women don't tend to get recorded as well and are lost. And so there's a view that just as God used Adam to create Eve, again, a very male orientated view in one of the biggest religions in the world, or the biggest religion in the world. Earlier on in time, it was man who had to create something to create the world.
And nobody ever talks about Lilith, the woman that divorced Adam.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, exactly. So, but to go back just a little bit about the belief in hell, and that happened. One of the things, so Proto-Indo-European as a language, we only hypothesize to exist because it was never written down and no one speaks it today. So you can't say it definitely existed. However, because you've got all these languages all over the Indo-European region, and we understand how languages evolve, we can sort of de-evolve them into a single language, and that is the Proto-Indo-European language. But one of the things we notice is that we can tell from certain myths and certain stories when they were created by the language they use, because you can see Proto-Indo-European language evolve, and therefore we know if they use certain terminology, it's come from a particular level of evolution of the language. And there was something called the Kentum-Satum split in Proto-Indo-European. And when we see that split, we see that the ferryman is of the dead. Uh, if you're familiar with that figure, in Greece, when you died, he took you across the River Styx.
You have to
Um,
always pay the ferryman as
always
well.
paid the ferryman, or you shouldn't have paid the ferryman. But there's a whole, well, there's so much mythology there. And
Got to give him
that
a tip
story,
at least. He's
yeah,
taking
that
you over.
exactly, and that story is at least 20,000 years old. But what we see is that when that goes into Persia, they start having a bridge, the caveat bridge, I think I remember it right, which is a bridge where your judgment is cast. And so you start seeing the non-judgmental right of the other world changing when this bridge is formed rather than ferryman in Persian mythology. And that eventually evolves further as it goes into the Indic mythologies, where and death becomes really important, such that if someone who actually prepares your body when you're dead is a sinner, then you will still go to hell even though you're dead and led a perfect life.
Okay. Interesting. So the pattern I'm seeing is that so we started out kind of roughly in one place or one area. There was one kind of key civilization or start civilization, and then afterwards, over the centuries and thousands of years, that group of people spread out and created all these different civilizations that we're still studying to this day. So like the Norse, the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons, um,
Okay, I'll probably have to
very
slightly correct you there because you could have upset a lot of people by that.
okay.
So,
Yeah.
we're talking about the Indo-Europeans spread out over Europe and Persia and India, but that's and have it had obviously massive influence because they went on to sort of in fact colonize the world over indigenous populations. But that isn't, or you got the very first people in the world long before then, sort of 60, 70, 80,000 years ago. So I'm sure, are you talking about the Indo-European people that spread out in
Yeah,
this?
so
Okay.
I was eventually just going to kind of go all the way across the map
Oh,
and
okay.
say
Yeah.
that
Okay.
the various Germanic tribes and Mediterranean, and because even though we were talking a little earlier about the myth of Tiamat, the depiction that you used in your video, um, I've been to I've been to Europe a couple of times, and one place that comes to mind immediately is the throne room in the Minoan ruins. And inside the Minoan throne room, the king's throne room, there are these paintings. And the picture that you used, the paintings all across the wall of the throne room are very similar. It's just a less frightening image. You take off the horns. I think that it's also the feet and the claws are more paw-like.
Okay.
And so what I want to try and get at is that there are these various chunks, these sort of fragments of the previous civilizations, if you would, that all originate from these first points. And when you're studying all of this, are these the things that you're actually looking for in order to piece together where it is that we came from?
So yes, there's all sort of imagery helps without a doubt, uh, but we are also very conscious that imagery changes a lot, and probably perhaps more rapidly than mythology. So there's a thing us mythologists sort of understand is that like the stories probably change much like genetics. Our genes change; they change very slowly over time, so we can understand a complex narrative even tens of thousands of years ago because that narrative remains. It doesn't change that much, but and the more it splits, the further away the common ancestor must have been. So what we look for is, I predominantly look for parts of stories, motifs that are similar. Now, and when you have those, then what you look for is supplementary evidence, such as you point imagery or other stories, and what we also look for is what the probability of cultural dispersion along that route. So, if let's say did if the Mesopotamians had this imagery of Anzu, who is the image you're talking about, which and that turns up in Greece, do we know if the Mesopotamians ever went to Greece or Greece went to Mesopotamia to see that imagery to allow it to be copied? And then if we think that happened and that happened within the timescales we're looking at, then there is a statistical probability that that may be the answer. The question is how statistical probably the probability of that. And that's where you have to add all the other information together to try and get that. But equally, many people would then argue that many things are statistically improbable as well. If you're not 100% sure. And that's one of the challenges I have with people on the channel, people, sort of skeptics, I guess to call them, they'll always point out the probability of something not being right. Like Proto-Indo-European was never a language, you can't prove it. Well, of course not, but we can't prove any language that existed before writing because it was never written down and it isn't being spoken. So yeah, it's something you just have to take, as with a grain of salt and carry on
Okay.
regardless.
So when you say when historians like you are saying Proto-Indo-European, um, is that just really a term for pre-recorded writing, or whenever you come up with something like that to describe to at least say this group of people spoke a language.
Mm-hmm.
It's not written down anywhere, but they had a language.
No, well, it depends. So Proto-Indo-European would actually drive us straight around the Black Sea area. Uh, but there are other languages like Proto-Germanic. So before German came a thing, before it was written down, there was Proto-Germanic, so Proto-Indo-European sort of flows into Proto-European. You could argue that had a form that was Proto-Germanic that went into Germanic languages, but they also split off into there's many other languages from Hittite and some went into Latin and French. So there are various stages depending on the time frame you're talking about, which will reflect on the language you're talking about to get there. But Proto-Indo-European, we often say because it's quite a general grabble. But when I say it, I know I'm talking probably about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago is when I really am referring to when I talk about a Proto-Indo-European doing something.
Could you give an example with statistics, which you were talking about just a minute ago? The statistics of how can you prove? Because you talk about or on your channel, you're typically drawing the lines from how we went from point A to point B.
Hmm?
Um, can you at least give like a quick sense of producing the statistics or the likeliness that that was the case or not the case?
So how we actually do that? So I say there's a number of different ways. So what we tend to do is we can get different versions of the same myth, or what we think are the same myth, and throw them all in a bucket and say what are the most common words or motifs of that myth, and it'll come up. This is the core myth that exists in all of these stories, and then we can see how different they are. And the more different they are, the more further away they must have been. So theoretically, they should be older. And then if we look at where those myths are from, we can understand the culture that would have told them. And if we understand the culture would have told them, we can understand the age of that culture because we know that through archaeology and DNA. And providing the age of the culture uh, matches the age of what we think the myth is, and that culture then could have migrated to a newer culture or to an old culture with a version of myth that also matches. So in effect, you have sort of myths and their age and their culture and the DNA, and you have a line of these, having looked at all these myths and how they've diverged from the core myth. You can see, well, can you draw a line between those? Did they actually migrate this route and does that all match? And if it does, then yay, happy, go out and have a decent cup of tea because you've obviously found something that's really important. But if they don't match, then then you go back to the drawing board. And this is where genetics has made a real big impact on what we do, because genetic analysis. And I don't really care much for genes. People often say because I study Proto-Indo-Europeans, I must be interested in your DNA, and that's really important, and racial stuff. And it's just nonsense. But I mean, I do really appreciate the work in genetics because it allows us to understand how people migrated. So, for example, we can tell that people migrated from Asia into Australia and Mesoamerica, Central America, at roughly the same time with the dragon myth. And that's quite interesting because of the DNA there. Okay, now that we can do things like that which we could never do before.
Because I remember I saw, God, I can't remember who it is on YouTube, but there was a particular video about Stonehenge and who were its original makers.
Okay.
And the video said at the time of Stonehenge construction, whoever the original, um, because I study a lot of my heritage is mythology and trying to understand um, where all of it came from. And so the Tafte Duan, I'm curious if this may have part of the origin. This may have something to do with the origins of that story because genetically it says that people came from Spain, took over Ireland, started mating with whoever was left over after that takeover, and they were the ones that that finished Stonehenge or were part of the finishing of it potentially.
Okay. So yeah, what we're talking about there is what people often refer to as the Celtic sort of culture. So without doubt, if you go to Ireland and do a DNA test, if you're Irish and do an air test, there's probably a chunk of Spanish in you, which sort of influences that, you know, your ancestors, some of your ancestors came from Spain. And that is, and we see this sort of migration up the coast of Europe, the west coast of Europe, where people went from Ireland to Spain and back again. And we do see stone circles in Spain and many stone monuments in Ireland too. Their culture's there. So there's no doubt these people probably influenced the building of Stonehenge, but Stonehenge wasn't built in a day or a year or 10 years or 100 years. It was built over many, probably over 1500 years or so, if I remember correctly. So there is no doubt the culture would have changed. And with, I would imagine, early European farmers would have been involved in some of that. And I would also imagine, because when the Indo-Europeans came along, they would have got rid of the early European farmers, and that would have stopped Stonehenge being built. And they'd have said, "What are all these? They must have been built by old gods or giants," which is another video. But Stonehenge must have started somewhere, and it probably, I'm more likely to say, it probably started from the same culture that built stone monuments in Spain and went to Ireland. Because before then, Stonehenge was just a wooden henge as well.
It's a wooden henge. Okay. So people built stuff out of wood before they started upgrading to stone.
Yeah.
Or that was like the blueprint for eventually what would become its.
Well, it was probably easier to build out of wood than stone, but that sort of also makes people wonder what it was actually for, because
Okay.
there's no one really understands what these monuments are for. Yeah, they do look like temples in a way, places you go to perform a ritual, and ritual was very important. It has been for tens of thousands of years. I mean, ritual is more important than belief in the early religions. People didn't pray to gods, like they didn't believe gods like many people do today in the, let's say, the Christian or Islamic faiths. People did, though, perform rituals because that was the important aspect of their belief. And so having area, a sacred area where you perform those rituals was very important. And but to actually understand what the actual purpose of why a circle, why in a particular way, that's always confused people. Now Stonehenge is a bit obvious because we can see it aligned to the sun, and so it was almost certainly built for the longest night of the year, not the longest day of the year, although it also matches that. And that is because the longest night of the year is probably the most important day in the pagan calendar to me, because that's when you're closest to the dead. And after this day, the days get longer. And that means life is going to start again. That's far more important than saying the days are getting shorter. You know, that doesn't make any sense. Why would you celebrate the days getting shorter? Yeah, you know, it doesn't work. So, yes, we understand Stonehenge from that point of view, but the actual, some of the stone monuments, if they were built out of wood, it just seems odd what that was for. It doesn't seem like, would that really make sense to have that as a ritual site? I don't know. So
I mean, it would make
these
more
questions.
sense to me, seeing that that could have initially been wood, and then over time people switched it to stone.
Yeah, that
Um,
happens a lot as well when we see
yeah,
that in many in British Isle monuments. We've seen that there's been wooden posts, although it's hard to detect those because it's organic.
or what I'm slowly planning to do to my house one day.
All right, I'll turn it to wood.
Turn it from wood to stone.
I'll turn wood to stone. Oh, okay, yeah.
Um, Now, it just kind of quickly, I know this is sidetracking, but why is it so important? Why is the nighttime and being closest to the dead so important for the pagan beliefs rather than uh, during the day? Because for someone like me, I would always imagine that the longest day would be more important because of the growth, because of the sun, because that means you get the most time outside, you get the most for growing. Like I would always imagine like June 20th and June 21st would be the most important days agriculturally because that's when you're starting to really get the berries and fruit and other things that are growing to come out rather than uh, December 21st,
Mm.
which is, I can imagine back then the winters were so much more harsh than, we could ever imagine. Um, and you're living in a shack and you're trying to survive
Mm.
and you're trying not to get frostbite. Why would the longest night and being so close to the dead be so important?
So being close to the dead is a sort of separate to food thing. So we approach them differently. So being close to the dead was just one of the things that our ancestors believed, that it was important to remember your ancestors. And that's why, and your important ancestors. And that's why they built tombs for the dead. You don't build a huge tomb for the dead if you're not interested in remembering your ancestor and maybe any tales or myth that came with that, because that ancestor probably helped establish your society. They're important in that way. And nighttime reflected being there. I mean, and that goes back to us believing the other world was in the dark, in water or in the depth of a cave. So I imagine there's some psychology around that. And don't forget, by the time like the longest night comes along or the shortest day, you know how much food you've got left till you can plant crops again. So your celebration, you know how long it's going to be. You know what food you've got to do that. If you celebrate in the middle of summer with all your food and yet the harvest doesn't turn up because something happens, you're that's the end of your society. You've eaten all your berries, but your wheat crop hasn't come in. That's not a good place to be. And so we do find in many societies there are harvest festivals later on, sort of September time, where the big celebration happens about the harvest. So that's how I would look at it, is that for us today, we enjoy a long summer's day, but for ancestors, it was the harvest day and it was the longest night that they were more important. And then you also had the spring day, which is when there was a lot of fertility things going on, planted of seed as a metaphor, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. That does make a lot more sense from needing to survive.
Yeah,
This is the
yeah. So you
marking
know
of,
what food you got left in
yeah,
winter. Yeah, it does. Yeah.
what food you got left very quickly with wood structures over stone
Mm-hmm.
structures. And so with stone, that was just a sign of technology. Like, oh, now that we can transport all these heavy stones.
And it looks like a more impressive feat. I mean, it is. I mean, look at Stonehenge. We see archaeological finds from the India there and things like that. Yeah, we see coins and beads that have travelled thousands of miles, suggesting that people may have travelled thousands of miles just to see Stonehenge.
Yeah, that's
And
pretty cool. That's pretty cool.
imagine you're 20 years old and you spend 5 years of your life just to travel to Britain to be greeted by rain every day, and they hadn't invented tea at that point, so it'd been really miserable. But you're there to see
Yeah.
Stonehenge before spending 5 years of your life trying to find back where you came from. Yeah, because there's no
Yeah.
maps or GPS. So yeah, that's got to be a really scary, phenomenal experience. And to trust someone has actually seen that place for you to go there. I mean, someone must have come back and said, "Oh, I found this really wonderful place on this island. Just go up the road 2,000 miles and you'll find it."
Scope the
What
road
the
to
hell?
go to them.
How did you just think about that in a time when there's no technology? How does that happen? And that's one of the magic of myths. How does a myth persist for tens of thousands of years when populations are so diverse? that same story is being told. That that means at some point we all must have wanted to tell the same story when we bumped into each other. Yeah, almost as a certainty. Otherwise, how would other cultures know that? Know these stories? It's absolutely. I would love to be able to see and how work out how that worked.
Yeah, that is really, it's very neat. That
Well,
is.
it's phenomenal. You think about it. Yeah, there was. I would imagine 60,000 years ago, there was probably only 10,000 active breeding pairs of Homo sapiens in the world. Certainly outside of Africa, there weren't that many, maybe 10,000. So everything's come from them, and they lived from Spain all the way to Siberia.
Yeah.
It's just,
So yeah, I mean,
it's just,
it came all this way. We came all this way from there,
yeah, but
and we
yeah,
have all
but
these myths, all these stories we're still
exactly. You
telling.
must have thought if you bumped into someone, it would have been natural to sit down and tell a story. That's what I feel. And if you look at some cultures, such as the Nordic peoples, they have the Havamal, which is almost like a book of Proverbs. And the first part of that is about hospitality. And this has got to be at least 1,000 years old. But it talks about when a guest shows up at your door, let them in and make sure they're warm and talk to them. And it's just like there's this nature of our ancestors that we've almost lost today. We don't necessarily have the same feeling about people, the same openness about letting people in and telling that. I mean, we do tell stories today, and we maybe go to a
Yeah,
bar and have a drink or a coffee shop, but it doesn't have the same, I don't know,
yeah. Like
things
have
about it.
to, like warm people up eventually. Like if I want to sit down and talk with someone, it's like,
Mm.
oh, like it's almost like calling in a shy dog.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It isn't like something we want to do, but back then it is what you want to do because we're so distracted. And I love that. That's one of the things that drives me. I honestly feel whilst I would not want to live 10,000 years ago because I'd probably die in a couple of years of some odd disease or
Oh yeah,
lying bit my head
or
off.
an animal would run into town and eat
Exactly.
you.
But the culture, there must be aspects of the culture that I'm sort of jealous of, although I'm not too sure what they are, but it just feels like there's aspects to that life about being human and being in a
Like the
society like that.
connectedness, right?
Yes, yes. And
Yeah,
that is what I would love to be able to recreate today for us.
yeah, that connected. We all share these different things. We're hospitable
Mhm.
with each other.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. We treat people with open arms initially rather than, yeah,
yeah.
care less.
That actually, yeah, that actually reminds me. There's I think it's I think it was a sociology. One of my first sociology teachers told me that human interaction was mostly exchanging stories. It wasn't there wasn't really in ancient times it was really very violent.
Mm.
Human interaction was not very violent until the need for resources came into play.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where most people blame the Indo-Europeans because they expanded so quickly they needed resources. But there was obviously violence before then. But it was yeah, it's I agree. The post Younger Dryas period we call that. So there was a period about 12,000 years ago where the Earth suddenly went cold for 1,000 years and then suddenly warmed up again. It's a very odd thing. We believe it's partially linked to lakes in America, uh, large lakes flooding into the Atlantic and changing the Gulf Stream and that. But it was after that humans we see Göbekli Tepe, the Turkish temple. I don't know if you're finished with Göbekli
Oh,
Tepe.
Gobekli Tepe. Yeah.
Yeah, um, being created and farming start, and it's after that that the world really changes. And I think that's when culture starts changing and we see wars starting to happen.
Okay. Um, hmm. There's signs of like they've unearthed all of that there,
Signs of
or like a giant farming society and
Not there was farming was certainly taking place at that time, but not around Göbekli Tepe. It was taking part in slightly other places. So, like about 20 miles away, you had, I think that's where the Tigris and the Euphrates start around that, not too far away. So that's where probably farming started, within a day's walk of there. So yeah, and it certainly was a ritual place. So I don't think there was much farming actually there, or people. I don't think many people actually lived there permanently. It doesn't look like that. It looked like it was a place people went to, which makes it really odd to have built such a structure, and yet no one's really living there. So
yeah.
it sounds like there's been a shift in religion as well. But you've got to ask yourself, and you sort of alluded to it, farming isn't really easy. So why do you stop hunting big meaty animals, which makes you big and strong, and start spending most of your days farming, eating not much at all? And we actually see a real physical difference between hunter-gatherers of the time and farmers of the time. Hunter-gatherers were significantly stronger and larger framed humans than farmers. So it's like there's something going on at this time to
Yeah.
make people want to do that.
Would
And
it be that this is another question because now it's coming to my mind is an Albert Lynn Lost Cities episode. He's talking about the kinds of ox or the kinds of bull, I think, that cavemen would have hunted.
mhm,
And these things are huge.
yeah,
So if you can imagine the size of like this 2,000 pound, one to 2,000 pound, like prized horses or animals. Now imagine this thing has horns on its head and it's incredibly violent. And you
yeah.
want to hunt it, it's going to come after you. This thing's going to put up a fight.
But
Um,
humans worked in teams, and that's where our advantage came along. Yeah, that I think. But yes, it is a scary proposition, but the benefit is huge of being able to eat a large animal like that.
yeah, there would have been. I mean, I can imagine how many steaks you'd get out of getting such a big animal.
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
so I'm curious too now because you're studying because I never really thought of that before. That never crossed my mind is why do we have these massive hunter gatherers and then suddenly they become these much smaller farmers? What was the
Well,
when you
why that happened? So there are different theories. The one that seems to gain most attention is the barley beer. What we find is that the most attention is spent to a form of alcohol that was brewed that may have made the difference. So the view being that if you grabbed a handful of barley seeds and put them in water, the dirt on your hand would probably ferment the barley seed and you'd create some kind of intoxicating drink, which we call barley beer, but it isn't anything like barley beer we drink today. But here's the thing: we find that a lot of barley is infected with a particular fungus, and this fungus causes a psychedelic effect. So what you'll find is that if people grow barley, harvest the seeds, and put a lot of the seeds in the water to make this beer, and then drink the beer, they're happy. They don't care that they're not the biggest people in the world because they're having these psychedelic moments, seeing things in the world they would never have seen before, and life has a different meaning. And it is a very persuasive argument, I must admit, that that is
so
possibly the reason why
so
we stopped hunting and gathering.
okay. So everybody suddenly got high and
Well,
was
we
too happy.
had these instances of yeah. I mean, yeah, I can't I can't think of another reason why you'd want to do it. I mean, because you're not eating better, you're working harder. There is nothing that makes sense about it unless there was an experience you were having that perceived it was a better life for you.
Okay.
But
That,
I'm not
that's
condoning the taking of fungus infected barley beer for anyone watching this, but
That
I'm just
makes you
saying there
shriv.
is a thought. But what we then find, which is really interesting, is that in many Indo-European tales, from the Vedic culture and its Soma to Greece to the Old Norse poetry, they all mention this kind of drink, like a mead of poetry or a drink that makes you hallucinate, is an intoxicating liquor. We see it in Mesopotamia. They drink this before the gods fight Tiamat. And you think, with all these traces of this drink in all these myths suddenly popping up, it's a strong argument to be had that that could be the key to it.
Yeah. So do you think that this was a huge enhancer, the importance of ritual, because this was something that started to really enhance anything anybody did, not just as like a pre-battle thing, but
Yeah, absolutely. A ritual, as I sort of touched on earlier, ritual and belief was more important than faith. Yeah, absolutely. And they
and
bit, yeah.
and did myths emphasize this? These stories
I think
emphasize this?
so. So here's an interesting fact. A lot of people don't know is the poems in the Poetic Edda of the Nordic cultures. I don't know if you're familiar with the Poetic Edda, but it's a collection of stories written around the time of Snorri Sturluson, or a collection of poems, and they tell different stories about what happened to the Nordic people. Well, many of those poems were actually ritualized, so they were performed. So you didn't just have some, because in the old days there wasn't a book. You didn't have someone sitting in the corner reading a book out loud to people. Someone told the story. And they didn't just tell the story by sitting down, not moving their arms. They stood up. They acted it. They got people involved. They created this sense of awe and wonder and making people scared and that, but by acting that out. And that's all part of the ritual of storytelling. So absolutely, and you'll see the best storytellers today. I mean, since COVID, I've managed to speak to a few storytellers. One of my best friends is doing his PhD just in storytelling, and it is just amazing watching him tell a story. It's almost like watching someone do a monologue of a great speech, and it's just fantastic stuff. And I can imagine when you didn't have your iPhones and TV, that sort of entertainment would have been just jaw-droppingly amazing for people. I mean, you go and hear a good storyteller around a campfire at night, or you go camping. I do it with a club of mine, and you've got a great singer in there, and he just sings a song, not a cappella, no instruments, and everybody sings along with the chorus gently, and there's just something so good about that. Yeah, it's an experience you can't buy. You just have to be there and take that in. Yeah.
Wow. Oh, that's great. Now it's like you gotta take me camping with you. I'm taking a trip to England and we're gonna go camping. All right. Technology has definitely helped a lot. Either if it's like what you do for IT, um, and as well as being able to look this stuff up online, have PDF, even talk to other people.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, has it thrown roadblocks as well? Has it made some of the process even harder? Or
absolutely. With every success, there is a bit of chaos. So, for example, as much as good information can be put on the internet, equally, the bad information multiplies just as rapidly. And we see this. As much as I've had this with my YouTube channel, as much as my channel has grown and has some great people in the community answering it, also with the size come more people who are skeptics or rude or just vulgar. You just get sort of an equal measure of that chaos with it. So for that point of view, it hasn't helped. But generally, because of my background and my knowledge, I've certainly have benefited tremendously from IT, because I'm lucky enough to be able to code systems and software to help me study and research, and I've done some exceptional things. I've been able to find out information I just would not have been able to do if I didn't have these IT skills in my role. Yeah, absolutely. IT has been a godsend for this sort of thing.
Yeah.
As well as the things I leverage, like genetic studies, which rely on IT to process genetic sequences rapidly to understand migrations. So yes.
And so then there's one thing. This is the part that I always become the most interested in, because I began to pick up on certain things the more I began to actively partake in activities that our ancestors would have partaken in. So, like as an example, even though there's a bunch of fruit bushes growing around the property I live on, if you pick them, uh, what you can't eat, you end up preserving somehow, some form or
Mm-hmm.
fashion. Um, that was also a big part of our ancestors' lives, was how do you take this food and then preserve it? And doing that process and getting out more, especially during COVID. There are other things I've picked up on. So being able to look at the light and guess the time of day. Sometimes a couple times I've been lucky enough to guess the exact minute, and also developing somewhat of an internal compass, like being able to figure out which direction's which, depending on where the sun is at the time of day. Um, you've pointed out there are certain stars, like how talking about creation, very early creation, that's like Ursa Major, and I think it was the Cosmic Hunt video.
Yeah, the Cosmic Hunt
Yeah,
video. Yeah, I've got to be careful I say that.
yeah. You said
Okay.
very like either like they had a very good perception and
Yeah.
being able to notice a star like that, which is a really hard star to see. Have you noticed studying these? There are certain either if it's connection with the land or the weather, or just perception, things that we've lost.
Exactly. We have no need to do it. So, I mean, how many people walk in the country at night time to see like the natural starlight, to hear the sounds, to see how woods change over, then forests change over the course of a year, what grows, what dies. People just don't do that. But if you do that all your life, and that is your life, you have no choice but to recognize these things. So yeah, I do think that's a real shame. And I try and take a walk at least 5 times a week, I'd say, through some kind of nature, like parks and woodland, just to, yeah, try and get a sense of feeling more real, I guess you call it, to breathe fresh air and that. But yeah, I really, part of me would love to live in the middle of a forest with nothing around me until I need something. Then I'd rather live in a city where I could just get it
Yeah.
instantly. But that is the curse of modern life. But I think we are missing a lot. So things we think are are sort of amazing were natural day-to-day occurrences to our ancestors. But equally, some of the things we fully understand were considering amazing to our ancestors, like eclipses or comets and things like that. We fully understand what they are, but our ancestors must have thought something strange is happening, or a meteorite shower, or certain weather events. These things just, how did they think of those? What influence did they have? Because it's very common perception for people today to think that our ancestors saw dinosaur bones, so they must have thought dinosaurs were dragons. Well, actually, that is actually a complete fallacy. That isn't how dragons came about. But it's not understanding how our ancestors thought will allow us to make these odd decisions about believing what they would have believed. So I think everybody should spend some time with nature and really start seeing the little things. Like I was out with a couple of people a few weeks ago in the woods, and I showed them a wood ant's nest. And wood ants are quite large ants in the UK, and they gnaw wood and build a pile of chips, wood chips. And if you actually close your eyes within a few feet of the nest, you can hear it buzz, hearing all the ants gnawing at the wood. And it's
Yeah.
just like little things like that you just would not know unless you'd spent time walking through the woods and seeing this and hearing this.
Yeah. That's cool that you picked that up.
Mm.
I used to be in pest control for a while, and once in a while you get to start to notice, oh, okay, they make that sound. Oh, they make that noise.
Yep,
But
that's why you want a stone house, I guess.
uh, that that one's a little easier to maintain.
Yes.
um, so, what has doing all this added to your perspective on life and
Wow,
not just with nature?
that's a big question.
But...
Um, as I sort of alluded to, I sort of part of me is living with a romantic idea that I'll discover the meaning of life by uncovering these myths and a belief or a way of life that we're missing today. That if I could add it into my life, it would be better. But at the moment, I'm just left with a sense of awe about how incredible it is that such a small number of human beings could share stories so well and maintain them across the world over tens of thousands of years. That is just, you know, an incredible thing. And where we get hints of myths, where the myths teach us to be more hospitable and more resilient, and it's just it gives me hope that we can have a better world. That we are all one people. That that's without sounding too preachy, but it just feels like we're all telling the same story and we all have the same root beliefs. We all come from the same genes. We are one people. So why can't we just treat ourselves like that?
Yeah, I agree with you on that. Why can't we all get along? And then, do you have a message for any future generations that'll watch this?
Um, a message. Just don't erase your history. It's really important to remember it.
All right, thank you, John.
There you go.